I've always believed that peace has a specific kind of rhythm to it. A low hum of the wind through the tall grass, the way the creek water gurgles over smooth stones in the early morning light, and the honest, steady creak of the old timber bridge that connects my world to the rest of the county. For nearly 20 years, that little bridge was my pride and joy. It wasn't an Oppo's. Some grand architectural feat, just a sturdy span of cedar and steel that I'd built with my own two hands back when my back was stronger and my hair was a whole lot darker. It was only meant to carry my old Chevy, a few delivery vans, and the occasional lawn tractor, but it was the gateway to my sanctuary, the only way into my 10 acres of quiet. And for a long time, it felt like it would stand there forever, unchanged by anything the world could throw at it. But then the neighborhood started to change. The city crept closer, and before I knew it, my little slice of heaven was being swallowed up by a new development called Whispering Pines, a place where people care more about the height of your grass than the depth of your character. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp October mornings where the coffee tastes just a little bit better, when the silence of the woods was suddenly shattered by the guttural roar of a heavy diesel engine that made the windows in my kitchen rattle. I walked out onto the porch, mug in hand, thinking maybe a neighbor was getting a pool put in or something, but instead I saw a massive, bright orange cement mixer grinding its gears right at the edge of my property, its huge drums spinning like some mechanical beast. Standing there, looking like she was ready to command a small army, was Lydia Thorne, the newly elected president of the Whispering Pines HOA, a woman who wore her blonde bob like a helmet and possessed a smile that felt about as warm as a stainless steel refrigerator. She didn't in Oppo's. Wave. She didn't in Oppo's. Say hello. She just pointed a manicured finger at my bridge and signaled the driver to move forward, even though the tires on that truck were probably wider than the entire lane. I dropped my mug and ran down the driveway, shouting at the top of my lungs that the bridge wasn't in Oppo's. Rated for that kind of weight, that it was a private span, but Lydia just looked at me through her designer sunglasses, adjusted her clipboard, and told me that the community and Oppo's, as progress didn't in Oppo's, stopped for, and quote, outdated infrastructure, end quote. I remember the way the air felt in my lungs as I stood there, watching that 12-ton monster roll onto my boards, the wood screaming under the pressure, the steel supports groaning in a way I'd never heard before, and all I could think was that this wasn't in Oppo's, about a construction project at all. Lydia's husband owned the contracting firm handling the new, end quote, recreational plaza, end quote. They were building on the other side of my creek, land that the HOA had bought up a year ago. And since my bridge was the only shortcut between the main road and their muddy lot, she decided it was now community property. When I told her she was trespassing, she just laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and told me that according to her, end quote, revised master plan, end quote, my driveway was now an easement for the neighborhood. And if I didn't in Oppo's, like it, I could take it up with the board, a board that she happened to handpick herself after the previous members got tired of her constant bickering. I spent that whole night sitting out on my porch with a flashlight, looking at the fresh gouges in the wood and the way the center span was starting to dip, feeling a slow, cold fire start to burn in my chest because I realized that being polite wasn't in Oppo's. Going to save my home. It was time to stop being a neighbor and start being a problem. The next few weeks were a blur of certified letters, end quote, violation notices, end quote, zip-tied to my mailbox for things as ridiculous as the color of my porch chairs and the constant, rhythmic thud of heavy machinery using my bridge as a highway, despite the 5-ton limit signs I'd bolted into the ground. My best friend Silas, a man who spent 40 years as a structural engineer and knows more about load-bearing stress than most people know about their own kids, came over one evening and just shook his head as he looked under the deck. He told me that if one more of those trucks crossed, the whole thing was going to snap. Not just the wood, but the main supports, and that I'd be left with a pile of toothpicks and no way to get my own car out of the driveway. Silas looked at me with that old, mischievous glint in his eye, the one he gets when he's about to suggest something slightly illegal but entirely necessary, and he asked me if I wanted to fix the bridge or if I wanted to, end quote, teach it a lesson, end quote. I chose both, and for the next 3 days we worked under the cover of the tree line, pulling out the heavy-duty grade 8 bolts that held the primary tension plates together and replacing them with custom machine shear pins, pins that would hold up just fine for a normal car, but would snap like dry pasta the second anything over 6 tons tried to put its weight on the center. It felt like a secret war, the kind fought with wrenches and grease instead of guns. And as I watched Lydia's husband's trucks roll by from my window, I felt a strange, calm sense of anticipation, like I was watching a storm cloud gather on the horizon and knowing exactly when the lightning was going to strike. I'd installed a high-definition trail cam hidden in the hollow of an old oak tree, and another one directly under the bridge deck, so I could see exactly what was happening in real time on my tablet. And I just waited for the pride of a woman like Lydia to outweigh her common sense. It didn't end oppos. Take long, because on a rainy Thursday morning, when the ground was slick and the creek was running high, I heard that familiar diesel rumble again. But this time was louder, heavier, a fully loaded tandem axle mixer, probably carrying enough wet concrete to pave a small airport. I walked out to the edge of my porch, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I saw Lydia herself standing on the passenger side of the truck, leaning out the window and waving at me with a triumphant smirk as the driver eased the front tires onto my timber. I yelled one last warning, just so the camera could catch it, and quote, "That bridge won in oppos. Hold you, Lydia. Turn back," and quote, but she just gave me the middle finger and told the driver to floor it. And that's when the world seemed to slow down into a series of sharp, violent sounds. As the rear axles hit the center span, there was a sound like a rifle shot. That was the first shear pin snapping, followed by a sickening, low-frequency groan of metal sliding against metal. The bridge didn't in oppos. Collapsed in the water, not entirely, but the left side dropped about 18 inches in a heartbeat, causing the entire truck to tilt violently toward the creek, and the drum, which was spinning at full speed, suddenly groaned as the centrifugal force pulled the whole rig further off balance. I watched in a daze as the rear hatch of the mixer burst open under the pressure, and a literal river of gray, wet cement began to pour out, cascading over the side of the bridge and directly into the pristine waters of the creek below, while Lydia screamed at the top of her lungs, her bobbed hair flying wild as she tried to scramble out of the tilting cab. She ended up jumping out right into a pile of her own husband and oppos, wet concrete, sinking up to her knees in the gray sludge, looking less like a powerful HOA president and more like a very angry, very confused swamp creature. By the time the local sheriff arrived, who I called the second I saw them approaching, the truck was wedged at a 45-degree angle. The bridge was a twisted wreck of splintered cedar and bent steel, and the creek was starting to look like a construction site in a disaster movie. Lydia was hysterical, pointing at me and screaming about sabotage, about how I was going to jail for life, about how I destroyed, and quote, community assets, and quote, but the sheriff, a man who'd seen me build that bridge 20 years ago, just looked at the, in quote, private property, in quote, and in quote, 5-ton limit, in quote, signs that were still standing perfectly straight, and then looked at the 12-ton truck half submerged in the mud. He asked her if she had a permit to move heavy machinery across private land, or if she had a written agreement from me, and the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I've ever heard in my life. But that wasn't oppos, to even the best part, because about a week later, after I'd been served with a $200,000 lawsuit by the HOA and oppos, as high-priced lawyers, we all ended up in a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old grudges. Lydia was there in a Navy suit, looking smug, thinking she was going to bankrupt me and take my land to pay for the, in quote, damages, in quote, I'd caused, but my lawyer, a woman named Elena, who has the temperament of a snapping turtle, just sat there quietly until it was our turn to speak. She didn't in oppos talk about the bridge at first. Instead, she pulled up a document from 1954, a federal riparian rights deed that had been buried in the county archive for 70 years, which stated that my property didn't end oppos. Just include the land, but the actual bed of the creek and quote, sovereign airspace easement, and quote, that even the state couldn't and oppos. Touch without a governor and oppos. Signature. Then, she played the video, the one from under the bridge, showing the truck driver intentionally ignoring the signs while Lydia shouted, in quote, keep going, I don and oppos, care if it breaks, end quote, through the window. The judge, a no-nonsense guy who clearly hated HOA disputes, leaned over his bench and asked Lydia and Appo's lawyer if he really wanted to continue a case where his client was caught on camera admitting to intentional property damage and trespassing. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice right then and there, but then the real hammer dropped because Elena presented an audit we'd done on the HOA's books with the help of a whistleblower on the board. It turned out Lydia had been using the community and Appo's emergency repair fund to pay her husband and Appo's company for work that was never actually done, and she'd used nearly $50,000 of the neighbors and Appo's dues to fund her legal vendetta against me. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been neutral or even on her side suddenly realized they'd been fleeced by the woman who was supposed to be protecting their property values. And within 48 hours, there was for sale, signing Lydia and Appo's yard in an emergency vote to dissolve the entire board. Now, I've got a brand new reinforced steel bridge, paid for entirely by the HOA's insurance settlement and a personal judgment against Lydia's husband's company, and the creek is back to its old, clear self after a massive cleanup effort they had to fund. I sit out on my porch most evenings now, listening to the water and the way the new bridge doesn't and Appo's to even flinch when my truck rolls over it, thinking about how some people mistake kindness for a lack of spine. I didn't in Appo's want a war. I just wanted to be left alone, but I learned that sometimes you have to break something to make people understand that it was never theirs to take in the first place. It's quiet again, the way it should be, but every time I look at that new span of steel, I'm reminded that gravity and truth always find a way to settle the score, even if you have to help them along a little bit with a few shear pins and a hidden camera. But it makes me wonder, looking at how fast the neighbors turned on her once their own money was involved, was it ever really about justice for them? Or were they just waiting for someone else to do the dirty work of standing up to a bully? I see people every day dealing with their own, Lydia's, people who think a little bit of power gives them the right to walk all over your boundaries. And I have to ask, at what point do you stop being the, good neighbor, and start being the one who sets the trap? Would you have waited as long as I did? Or would you have snapped a lot sooner? Let me know what you think, because out here, the boundaries are the only things keeping us from total chaos, and I'd love to hear if you've ever had a fight for yours. Don and Appo's. Forget to like this if you've ever wanted to see Karen, get what's coming to her, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who decided they'd finally had enough.